So patch 6.0 dropped, and there were a lot of changes. However, paradoxically, I'm not really seeing too terribly much changes to the builds that I've posted before. We're going to run through each of those, just like the previous comprehensive build video. I'm going to ask this at the beginning here, just because most people are still watching at this point. Have you all noticed any weirdness with gun strikes? It seems like after this patch in particular, they're now only restoring half of the contested health. Maybe it's just me. Maybe that's been a thing for a while and I've been too deep in the AO mod. I don't know. Let me know. Comments. Do your thing. All right. So coming up first, we got the tactical. Grenade launcher got nerfed pretty hard. We talked about that in the patch coverage, and yes, you do feel it. However, it is absolutely still viable, so long as you consistently hit headshots with it, considering it got a reasonable amount of percentage buff. And you just now have to be a bit more particular about the things you yeet 40mm grenades downrange at. Is it the most effective option? No. Still, for the sake of completeness, let's look at the perk tree. With the extra point, due to maxing things out with Relic, I picked up the extended magazine just to get that extra grenade. Since, right now, total ammo count matters even more. Just to recap the nerfs real quick, the talent that gives you ammo restoration on Majoris or higher execute now only refunds one grenade instead of the entire reserve. Maybe ask politely for your other group members to share some of the ammo crates. The bolt pistol, not much has changed here. We just wound up picking up the extra 10% damage from my previous build. So, top line all the way down, pick up the headshot damage, pick up the spread reduction, extra mag size, extra damage. Easy enough. With the chainsword, again, well, we just picked up the either extra damage against Majoris or the extra 5% flat melee damage to everything. Depending upon what you wound up going with before with the previous build, you're going to pick up one of these two perks with the new mastery point. Looking at other options. Plasma Incinerator is still strong. I prefer the one that comes with higher venting speed. Your mileage may vary. You might prefer the one that has the higher rate of fire for faster charging. Both are fine. For perks, I wound up taking the extra point from Mastery and picking up this extra 25% projectile speed on your charge shots, just for a little bit of extra quality of life. Realistically, sure, you could pick up Supercharged Shot for an extra 10% damage on your charge shot. However, when I was testing things before, I didn't really notice any significant difference in breakpoints. You're still needing to hit a Tyranid warrior, for instance, with 3, 4, sometimes 5 of the charge shots to send them into execute on absolute. Either of these is fine. More quality of life? Go with charge speed. More damage? Go with supercharged shot. Now, in my testing, the runs that I had the most success with the tactical were using the Stalker, which, it was viable before, sure, but with the overall changes to the grenade launcher, it comparatively makes the Stalker much, much more competitive. I really liked the Stalker from the get-go, so if this is your first time looking into it, lean in, it's good. Just to make the ammo economy a little bit more palatable here, I go with the one that has the most ammo. Sure, you could get the 12 plus damage on this one, but especially considering the limitations in absolute in terms of the ammo economy, take what you can get. For perks, we got this windy thing going on. Extra damage for things far away. Extra damage when we're hurting. Less recoil. Admittedly, this one's not super important because you can just fight recoil with your mouse or your stick. Sacrificial point for fast regen. This is to get over to 10% more headshot damage. And another 10% more headshot damage. And we'll snake back down to pick up 20% extra ammo reserves. And reloaded restoration, which is really the point in which the Stalker bolt rifle starts to shine and actually be viable. So it says, after reloading, your ammo reserve is restored by 50% of the number of enemies hit. You cannot exceed your maximum ammo capacity. So this, plus some of the class perks that we'll talk about in a moment, really does make the ammo economy of the Stalker bolt rifle quite generous, even better than the Plasma Incinerator. And finally, we pick up Great Might for an extra 10% damage against terminus enemies. Because, hey, free damage. Looking at the perks, this first column, you're either going to go between the new buffed Plasma Boost if you decide to use the Plasma Incinerator, or you're going to use the Kraken Penetrator rounds to penetrate one more enemy. Again, with my testing, with the particular variants of the Stalker I was using, balanced distribution didn't push you past any meaningful breakpoints in terms of how many bullets it takes to put an enemy into executable. So, for reference, outside of Auspex, the Stalker was consistently putting Tyranid warriors, the ranged versions, into execute with 4 headshots. And you can throw that out real quick. So maybe just take the extra penetration to clear out hordes a bit better. Moving on, heightened vigor is still kind of butts. So meh. Realistically, between these two, we have Relentless Pursuit, which increases your range damage for 5 seconds by 25%, or your secondary weapon can have 25% more damage until you reload or swap back. Realistically, the uptime of versatility is going to be significantly higher. However, the basic bolt pistol leaves a little bit to be desired. If you're using the Stalker, well, you're not running into as much ammo problems as you would be on other weapons. So, seeing as how you're going to be up in the thick of it, and we're using the fencing variant of the chainsword because I feel like way too many people sleep on the stun you get off of a perfect parry, even if you don't follow it up with a gun strike. People are just like, oh no, we got to go with the block to do the most damage. I'm thinking, yeah, that's great. But that guy over there is sitting there with a dumb look on his alien face for like 4 seconds. Don't sleep on that. For the next column, you're still going to stick with Emperor's Vengeance, because it still works just the same for all of the other weapons. With the exception of a bug with the Melta rifle that I heard about last night, where it questionably has like consistency in terms of whether it will actually give you ammo back or not. So maybe avoid the Melta for the time being until this is changed. For the team perks, we did see some significant changes to the other worse talent choices. They still don't rise to the level of being able to take them in good faith, because Communion of Fire is really just a worse version of the Aligned Aim. So with Aligned Aim, you get 15% range damage for everyone, whereas with Communion of Fire, you get 10% more range damage against Extremis and 25% recoil reduction, so you can be lazy. Or you could just pull down on your mouse or your right stick. Even so, with these changes, I still think transhuman physiology is the strongest here, because everyone in the squad is going to restore 30% more contested health. And that's going to be useful for you, and it's probably going to be useful for the potatoes that you're pugging with. Potatoes live longer, you finish more missions. Moving on to gear. I was actually kind of anticipating this section changing at all, based on the patch notes. That is not the case. We're still sticking with priority targeting to get a significantly longer Auspex scan, while ignoring Minoris enemies, battle focus, so that you just Auspex anything you perfectly parry or block, and expert timing, so that the Auspex actually hurts much more, while still giving you a much longer Auspex scan as a whole. Realistically, sure, you could make the argument for vital data. I would struggle to come up with a reasonable rationale for target lock. Precise calibration, maybe, but no. I prefer the way expert timing works, just because you can work against some of its shortcomings by taking priority targeting. Improved efficiency sounds cool on paper. It's very similar to the other perks that, if you kill X enemies in rapid succession, you refill a grenade. Again, in terms of columns, I feel like your best bang for buck and most consistent uptime is going to be battle focus. So nothing has changed with these 3 perks. So as for the signature perks for the tactical, yes, again, we did see significant changes to the first 2 points, in that Signal Jammer now automatically causes things that are calling reinforcements to explode, which is cool. I appreciate the mental image there. You can interrupt reinforcement calls with almost any weapon in the game very quickly. Your Auspex has better uses, and further, your signature perk has far better uses. Next, we have Radiating Impact that saw a significant buff. I was testing this one at length because I really wanted it to be good. If we're going to lean into the idea of you're in there perfect parrying and auspex scanning things and getting executes and refilling your ammo and like, oh, the synergy. However, the cooldown in and of itself is a bit inconsistent, and I found myself really wanting it to go off at some times and being really annoyed when I was executing a random Majoris off in a corner by himself. And it's like, oh, well, I guess that perk's wasted for the next minute and a half. Yes, that same argument does apply for Marked for Death as well. I would argue, though, that the ability to apply that to Extremis makes it much, much more valuable. Because if you can instantly delete a Ravener who's giving you a non-consensual hug, that has some pretty significant value. And if you randomly manage to pop a random warrior or rubric or whatever, you're still going to, appreciate that change. So, tactical, done. So for the assault, a bit of a caveat here talking about the assault. Yes, there were wide sweeping buffs to a great many things and significant buffs, or nerfs, I should say, to overall survivability and one of their stronger perks. If you're here looking at a build guide video, chances are you haven't taken the time, you don't have the time, you're not willing to go into all of the different testing to min-max absolutely the most perfect mathematical conclusion, right? And build guides are most commonly aimed at beginners. So let me just get this out of the way at the beginning. Yes, I'm aware that you can do absolutely silly things with the block hammer, and we'll talk about that as we work through. This is not that. Because again, if you're confident enough and proficient enough with your play to be able to consistently use the block hammer, you're not the intended audience of this video. Congratulations, you're more advanced than that. Go spread the Emperor's mercy. Anyway, getting into it. We're going to start with the heavy bolt pistol, because I like it, and frankly, the Neo-Volkite is still lackluster, outside of a few very specific use cases. And the headshot modifier on the heavy bolt pistol is actually quite good for secondaries. I'm going to go with the Affiliation Liberation Alpha, personal preference. If the ammo economy matters less to you and you can make the others work, go for it. I feel like having the extra wiggle room is nice. So for perks, really it hasn't changed from my previous video. We're going along the top tree to pick up some spread reduction here, which lets us use the version that has the extra ammo without suffering too much from the penalties to accuracy. The extra point we get from Mastery is going to go to Divine Might for a flat 10% damage buff. Nice. For the hammer, I'm going to go with the Balance Hammer, just because I've spent enough time playing with balanced weapons that I feel like I can consistently hit those parries. And as we talked about in the tactical section, the value of having an enemy stunned, even if you don't follow it up with a gun strike, really shouldn't be overlooked. I feel like way too many people get blinders on about just doing absolutely the most damage possible at the expense of literally everything else. So, perks. We wound up picking up this extra Majoris for 10%. If you were following my previous build guide, you might have taken that instead of this flat 5% here, or 10% when you have full armor. But again, just go down the bottom tree so that you can pick up the improved Aftershock to get the double bonks, and you reduce your Aftershock preparation time by 30%. Reminder, for Aftershock, you charge it until you hear the first audio cue. That's the charging up woof effect. Then you release the Aftershock. That is the most efficient use of charging time to damage ratio. Plus, realistically on higher difficulties, standing still charging for an inordinate amount of time is likely to get you killed. So, let's not do that. If you decided to go with the block, cool. That's going to change some of the perk choices for the assault itself, but you can work around it. And again, if you're going with the block hammer, this video isn't for you anyway, because you don't need it. So, perks. This first column actually did see some meaningful changes. I really want to take Overcharge, especially now that it's a flat 25% buff to all charged melees. However, I feel as though the sustain granted from armor reinforcement, even though it now only restores 1 pip, is still worth it. especially for people who are looking for guidance on where to start with a build and then make it their own. Winged Fury is still kind of butts. This is that moment where in my head, I've got that meme of stop trying to make that happen, it's not going to happen. But in this case, it's about the Pommel Strike build that popped up shortly after release that people were trying to make work. Just no, don't do that, because math. Anyway, second column. Realistically, options are the same. You have Auxiliary Arsenal if you're the kind that really likes to plink away at things or lean into gunstrike damage. However, consecutive execution has been drastically improved. So, 10 enemies, you get 1 equipment charge, melt a bomb silliness. It's now a 1.5 minute cooldown instead of 3. So, either of these two, you're fine with. It's a function of how you prefer to play. So for the third column here, we have Perseverance, which gives you 15% less health damage taken while you're charging attacks. You don't get knocked back, etc. Or we have Knowledge of the Enemy for an extra 15% against Majoris and Extremis, just writ large. There's also Active Attrition, which if you wanted to really lean into being a team player, would be the most mathematically ideal option, provided that you're playing with people who are actually going to shoot at the thing that you're bonking. I think we all know how likely that is if you're playing in pugs. So, unless you have a really well-coordinated group, I would say stick with Knowledge of the Enemy just for the flat 15%. Alright, so for the team perks. Again, we saw buffs to the other 2 weaker talents as well as a nerf to the strongest one. Now it's a little bit more of a matter of personal preference. Even though it got taken to 30% from 50%, I do still feel like Proven Efficiency gives the entire squad a decent amount of value overall, especially, depending upon like strategic strikes where you do extra melee damage against Extremis and Terminus. I mean, that's cool. Extremis are going to be dying pretty quickly anyway if you're playing with people who are halfway competent. And depending upon your class, you may not necessarily want to be meleeing a Terminus enemy. So, circumstantial here. As for squad cohesion, like on paper, yes, this sounds cool. Yeah, everybody just gets 10% faster recharge. Let's use the jump pack as an example. If I remember right, the jump pack charges are a 45-second cooldown without any modification. So, if you take 10% of that, that now makes it a 40.5-second cooldown. Is that nothing? No. Would it have an outsized influence on like Bulwark's friendship flag? Yes. So, depending upon what you're playing with, I would say go with either squad cohesion or proven efficiency. If you don't know what you're playing with and you're just playing with pugs, maybe go with proven efficiency. Make them more badass and hopefully stay alive longer. For the gear, I tinkered with so many new options here. I mean, again, unless you're going with the block version of the Thunderhammer, in which case, again, you can figure out your own perk choices here, in which case you likely wouldn't need one of these 3 that boosts ground pound damage, but I like my parries. So, yes, at first glance, this looks like anti-synergy. It is not, because we're taking an extra 100% more damage with a 50% reduced radius. This does still provide plenty of radius and plenty of damage, such that Zealous Blow works really well. Because if you're jumping into a cluster of enemies, it's usually a bunch of gaunts chewing on and around a warrior's feats. Feats? Feats is not a word. Well, it is a word, but it talks about like excessive personal ability and not the thing at the bottom of your legs. Thanks, brain. Glad you're on my team. Anyway, in terms of this column, ground pound kill restores jump pack's charge by 10%. Again, we did the math earlier, so each ground pound kill knocks 4.5 seconds off your cooldown. So, if we take that and look at maneuverability, this just gives you 9 seconds faster charge on each charge. So, if you manage to kill at least 2 things with each ground pound combo, well, you're making that back. And you're still providing yourself ample opportunity to kill more than 2 things and get more of a regen. Wings of Flame sounds cool. I've tried it. With the nerf to gunstrike damage, it really just kind of doesn't feel great, at least to me, and how I prefer to play the Assault. Maybe tinker with it. I don't see that being a strong frontrunner. Up next, we have the column that has Pride in Duty, Diligence, and Aerial Grace. Starting from the bottom here, we have Aerial Grace. After a perfectly timed dodge using a jump pack, you deal 30% more damage for 10 seconds. So again, I mean, this sounds really cool if you pair that with Wings of Flame and maybe Commitment. But the overall exposure to damage that you're putting yourself at risk to with this build versus, jumping up in the air and then Goomba stomping a cluster of dudes, the balance on that didn't feel great to me. Your mileage may vary. For Diligence, you could take this one if you didn't want to monitor your own buffs here. So you've got 20% more ground pound damage, but your preparation time increases by 25%. I'm already hanging out in the air, feeling like I'm at a rave with all of the snipers pointing at me all the time anyway. Anything that keeps me in the air longer, I'm not a fan of. So to that end, I go with Pride and Duty, so I usually try to time my jump pack to ground pound after like a gun strike or an execute. So flat 25% more damage for 10 seconds. You can do some work here without getting the downside of the extra preparation time. Does this require you to have a little bit more micro? Yes. Is it worth it? I think so. So for the signature perks, unless you're going to go with that weird jump pack dash perfect dodge build, in which case you'd go with Commitment, I still really feel like Ascension's your only semi-viable option here, just to get an extra tick of damage when you take off. Just be careful you're not next to any red barrels. Oh, and a quick note here. Even with the Power Fist buffs, it's still subpar to the Thunderhammer in terms of per swing weapon damage. And since your ground pound scales off per swing weapon damage, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to nerf yourself by choosing to do less. Now, if you can suddenly become Neo with a Power Fist and just wade through enemies and still be super effective, cool, good on ya, go for it. If you're here looking at a build guide because you can't make something work, maybe don't make your life harder than it needs to be, yeah? All right, so for the Vanguard, we got a reasonable degree of nerf with Adrenaline Rush. And realistically, not a whole lot has changed about this build either. So let's get into the weapons right off the bat here. So Melta Rifle, I like the one that has the extra ammo, because again, if I'm up in a throng of enemies, I don't really have to worry about range all that much. If you prefer the version that has extra range and you're not fussed by the limitations to the ammo economy, go for that. That's cool too. Perks, with the extra mastery point, you're just going to pick up Perpetual Fire here, since we went all the way along the top, with the exception of picking up Fast Reload. Yes, there are some arguments to be made for going along the bottom side to get faster reload and, these extra effective range pips. That's not how I play Vanguard. If you can make that work for you, cool. So in terms of bolt pistol or Volkite pistol, either option is fine. For the bolt pistol, it's the same as it was for the tactical, top tree, come down, pick up this last mastery point here. For the Volkite, I'm reminded every time I come back and play vanilla just how mediocre the Volkite pistol is versus what it could be. That said, when I was doing the testing on the Volkite pistol before, the bottom tree consistently produced more meaningful damage and DPS than the top tree. Link to that video will be somewhere up there. For the extra mastery point, you can pick up Distributed Deflagration. So along with the Volkite Explosion, 25% of the heat is also transferred to surrounding enemies. This seems like a very niche thing. It could be cool if you're trying to use the Volkite pistol against more than one thing far away. Or you could go with heat retention, so heated enemies cool down 25% slower. I feel like this is a choose your flavor of terrible ice cream, or what are they called? The jelly bellies of mystery flavors. Either of these aren't great. Pick the one you like less more. For the melee weapon, I'm going to always stick with the balanced combat knife. Yes, I know some of you prefer the block one. Again, if you're at the point where you're proficient with the block weapon and feel like you're already stomping things, why are you here looking at a build guide video? So, balanced knife plus the perk on the class itself gives you a pretty comfy overall window in terms of when your frames actually parry. You get the bonus of that one enemy standing there with a dumb look on its face for 3 or 4 seconds. You can chain that into a gun strike or not. Plus, the balanced knife is fast enough that you can stagger lock most Majoris enemies most of the time. You don't get that with the fencing one. So, and given the option to have this, no, I'm not going to go with the chainsword. For your other weapon options here, the Instigator is still decent. It did get some buffs. Just don't use the Oculus. Come on now. Again, I prefer the one that has the most ammo in reserve, just because the 3-shot burst is pretty easy to counter the recoil of, and in your higher difficulty tiers, the ammo economy boss is the thing you're fighting the most. For the perk tree, this is exactly the same as it was in the previous video. Only change here would be after maxing out Relic, you would come in and pick up either Rampage for a flat 25% more damage for 5 seconds after killing 10 things, or if you wanted to be lazy, you come back and pick up Adamantine Grip to further reduce that recoil on the burst by 25%. Maybe don't be lazy, maybe make use of the extra damage. But I won't judge you if you decide to go with a better quality of life. We just won't tell anyone. Okay, character perks. You might notice this is exactly the same as my previous build. That's because even with all the other changes, this one still works, and still works really well. So in this first column, we have Moving Target, which just got some pretty significant buffs. So if you land 10 melee attacks within 5 seconds of each attack, you get a 20% reduction to range damage taken, which sounds cool. And then you look over at this one and see you get just a flat 10% against Majoris and higher. And since, well, your job is to go introduce Stabby McKnife to enemies' innards, maybe use this. Upper Hand is still weird. I'm not sure why you'd ever want to take that one. Just because after a perfectly timed parry, block, or dodge, you don't lose control on taking heavy hits and you can't be knocked back for 10 seconds. Sounds cool. That said, if you're eating heavy hits consistently on Absolute, you're having a bad time. So maybe make things dead faster. For the second one, I'm always going to stick with Duelist, which I just now noticed has a typo. So this one gives you a wider perfect parry and block window by a pretty significant amount. This is what lets you use the balanced knife with a greater degree of comfort. I mean, sure, if you wanted to be super try-hard about it and just get good with the balanced knife's timings, that would open up the option to take close combat focus to just 20% less range damage. Or maybe Conviction, where if your armor is fully depleted, you take 25% less health damage for 10 seconds. Either of these could be fine. I like Duelist just because it makes my life simpler. It's one less thing to have to try hard about while I'm juggling ammo and saving teammates, you know? Or, perhaps more accurately, panic rolling away from the thing trying to peel my face off. So for the third column, Retribution got buffed a bit, Consecutive Execution got that same significant buff, and Honed Reactions is the same. This is kind of similar to the column just before it in my eyes. Like, Retribution on paper sounds great, but again, if you're getting grabbed or knocked back consistently on Absolute, you're having a bad time. It doesn't matter how much more melee damage you do if you're already dead. Consecutive Execution can do some cool stuff with melt-a-bombs or crack grenades. Totally viable. I blow myself up with melt-a-bombs as often as I make like ridiculously cool plays with them. I know myself. I'm gonna go with Honed Reactions just because having that extra perfect dodge window when I'm already hurt sounds really nice, makes my life easier, has actually saved runs. Whereas Consecutive Execution has cost runs, and yes, I'm aware that's a skill issue on my part. Okay, team perks. They tried to buff the other two. I would say that both Melee Champion for 15% more melee damage, and Unmatched Zeal, which gives extra health restoration for any squad member who executes an Extremis or Terminus, still pale in comparison to the value that's always up for the entire squad that Inner Fire gives you. So, anytime you execute something Majoris or higher, I mean, yes, it hurts that you can't just stomp on a Gaunt and get it back now. There's plenty of Majoris enemies in higher difficulties. Even with the nerf to the Bulwark's friendship flag, we were running Vanguard Bulwark a little bit on stream last night, and Inner Fire really just made the recharge of that flag so insanely fast that the Bulwark had their flag again by the time we got to the next pack. Yes, this causes you to potentially lose out on 15% more melee damage and more melee damage for the rest of your squad. However, if you're playing with people who actually know how to use their abilities, inner fire is always going to be better. So for the gear perks, we did see some pretty significant changes. I did test a good chunk of these off stream last night. So in this first column, we have Restless Fortitude, which lets you take 20% less range damage for 10 seconds after grappling to something's face. Shockwave, which deals damage in a 5-meter radius. This was recently buffed to scale with difficulty. Then Collateral Damage, which deals 10% more damage as a whole and damages enemies between you and the thing that you're attached to. This one is still lackluster. Like, there's nothing wrong with it, but in comparison with the other two, I feel like you're not going to get as much value. On Absolute in particular, I can see there being a bit more of an argument for Restless Fortitude, because anything that helps you take less range damage, or less damage at all, is going to be beneficial. If you feel like you need the extra tank, take Restless Fortitude. If you don't, take Shockwave, because a little bit of extra damage means things are that much closer to breakpoints. All right, for this next column, we have Zone of Impact, which lets you perform a finisher with the grapnel launcher and cause an AoE explosion. They're really trying to make this finisher with a grapnel work. However, the columns that the perks are on really don't make it tenable. So after that, we've got Tenacity. After killing 10 enemies, you get 40% more damage on Diving Kick for 15 seconds. Cool, sure, I guess. I would much rather stick with Tip of the Spear. Anything that's going to cause enemies to take more damage, not just from me, but from the entire team, for 10 seconds, is huge. Because you can go attach yourself to a Carnifex or a Hive Tyrant or even a Zoe now, which is cool. And then everybody who's shooting at that is just going to do more damage to it. I'm a fan of things that make the entire team more effective. For this third column, you have realistically two choices, I think. You have Thrill of the Fight, which says after a perfectly timed parry, block, or dodge, you take 20% less health damage for 5 seconds. I mean, this, plus maybe taking Restless Fortitude, I mean, you're getting a pretty decent amount of stacking damage reduction talents. So that could offset the nerf to Adrenaline Rush and just make your life easier. Grim Determination. We tested this on stream yesterday. It no longer works when only one of your charges are on cooldown. So this is only active when both of your grapnel charges are gone. So unless you're using your grapnel charges back to back, you're really not seeing a whole lot of meaningful uptime on this talent. Then we have Combat Readiness, which lets your grapnel recharge 20% faster. If you feel like you really don't need the tank or extra breathing room from Thrill of the Fight, yes, by all means, take Combat Readiness. 20% faster cooldown is a 20% faster cooldown, even if, that is only 9 seconds per charge. Still, has value. Don't sleep on it. Now for the signature perks, and they're trying real hard to make these other ones happen. But even so, sure, grapnel launcher activating a finisher, but also on anything lower than 25% health, except for bosses, of course, sounds really cool. And it restores your grapnel charge. You can zipline around the battlefield for days. Cheat Death is still a thing. Cooldown's 120 seconds now. Sure, that's fine. Even with the nerf to making it 5% on Adrenaline Rush, I'm still going to stick with this. Yes, you feel it a little bit. It's not the end of the world. And realistically, even if you're only restoring, half a health bar over the course of several minutes, well, that's a med kit that you've saved for someone else. Or that's a friendship flag that you've saved for someone else. Still good. Still works. Yes, it's lame that we got nerfed. Okay, moving on to the Bulwark, which is the other one that people were big mad about. Starting with the weapons. If you have the option for the plasma pistol, you take it. I like the one that has the most ammo, just because, more ammo on a plasma pistol is always nice. And realistically, its main use for me is interrupting reinforcement calls from across the map or just exploding a cluster of crunchies. Anyway, perks. You don't really have a whole lot of cool options with the mastery point that you'd get from maxing it out in Relic with the build I was going with before. So just to recap, that's faster cooling, 25% more damage after you explode 10 things, extra damage on charge shots, extra radius on a charge shot, even more radius, faster charge, more ammo, and this is the one that's kind of meh. After a perfectly timed dodge, damage radius of a charge shot increases by 10%. Cool, great. don't care. My primary purpose with this build was making it charge as fast as possible, be as efficient as it could, and really just be an interruption machine. For melee weapons, yes, I'm still sticking with the power sword. Sure, the updates to the power fist you might be able to make work. With the amount of time I've spent with both weapons, I'm still just going to be more effective with the power sword, and mathematically it does still work better. So, I'm sticking with fencing. If you want to be super tryhard about things, you can go with either of the balanced ones. I wouldn't recommend block, just because having the opportunity to chain into gun strikes, even though that's been nerfed, is still big for your survivability. Anyway, also, before anybody yells at me about the power sword, like in the last video, skins are a thing. Maybe don't assume which version I'm using based on what it looks like. So, perks. Going with the top tree, working back down here to pick up both of the 10% boosts to enemies. Coming back up through here to get the extra damage on Majoris, and then this last one. I've tried a few other options here, but I really like speed style attacks restoring 100% more contested health. That gives you significantly more regen ability that doesn't rely on you quickly swapping to your plasma and charging it and dumping it into somebody's face. Just a little bit of extra sustain to counteract some of the other nerfs is really quite enjoyable. All right, talking about perks here. Again, not a whole lot has changed. So for this first column, you have really the option between Intimidating Aura and Conviction. Just because forward momentum, I mean, sure, if you wanted to be super micro about it and remember to use Shield Bash all the time, 30% boost is nice. Even with the nerf, adding that 5-second internal cooldown, you're going to be parrying things anyway, at least with this build, unless you're using a block weapon. If you are using a block weapon, maybe go with forward momentum. I can see that being really silly. But since we're not using it in this build, extra damage within 5-meter radius, anytime you parry once every 5 seconds, that has value. If you need more tank, go with Conviction instead. So when your armor is fully depleted, you take 25% less health damage for 10 seconds. Again, if you need the tank, swap to it. If you don't, and you want things to die a little bit faster, go with Intimidating Aura. So for this next column, we were tinkering with this pretty significantly on stream, and I did a little bit more off yesterday. So Armor of Contempt has not had the most stellar of track records as to whether or not the talent actually works. In my testing, and I'm aware that an N of 1 is not indicative of a trend here, the talent was remaining active for the duration of a mission, even if I went down and was revived, or even if I died entirely and had the 300-second wait of shame to get through. So, if you are able to block a ranged attack, enemies within a 10-meter radius take the damage instead. This works really well when you're tanking and blocking enraged bazooka guys, or shotgun guys rather. It's nice. That said, the shock build is still fine if you really want to go for that. Scrambled targeting, I think, would probably be your better other option if you're not going to go with Armor of Contempt. Just because if you are surrounded by 5 or more enemies, you take 25% less damage from ranged attacks. Now, previously, they've changed the AI to preferentially avoid shooting at enemies that are already engaged in melee combat by, I think it's 3 or more enemies. Fact check me on that. I'm happy to be corrected. If you do, link me to the patch notes. I'll pin that comment. In the events where you are still getting targeted by ranged enemies, a flat 25% less when you're in the thick of it, like you should be as a Bulwark, that's nice. For this next one, we have Defensive Advantage. This goes with the shock build, where a perfectly timed parry or block creates a shock area, cooldown of 30 seconds. We have Steel Within. When your health is less than 50%, you take 30% less health damage. Or Armor Reinforcement, where non-finisher gun strikes restore 1 armor segment. This is the one that was significantly nerfed, because previously it was restoring your entire armor bar. I did still feel this when I was running on Bulwark yesterday. However, out of the available options, if you're not going to go with the shock build, I feel like this is still your best bet. Just because a little bit of extra sustain, even though armor evaporates at higher difficulty levels, has some synergy with Armored Advance that we'll talk about in a bit, and just spares you some damage to your red health that you then have to fret about refilling. For the team perks, they gave some pretty significant buffs to focused restoration that we talked about in the patch recap video. Every 40 seconds, all squad members automatically restore 1 armor segment, which sounds really cool. However, let's look at effective formation here. All squad members take 20% less health damage from Extremis and Terminus. I mean, cool, sure. But out of the 3 options, I still say advanced conditioning is the strongest here, because that causes the entire squad to have their contested health fade 50% more slowly. And that helps you, that helps your friends, that helps the random potatoes you're pugging with, and that also helps your friendship flag, if you're able to time the executes, have a bit bigger of a window to maximize that gain. Nothing's changed here. For your gear perks, the first column here, we have Purity of Purpose. This hasn't been changed except for scaling it with difficulty. Deals damage over time to enemies within its area of effect. Depending upon how you wanted to play this, I could see stacking this with the shock build, produce absolute silliness if it's not the most mathematically effective thing, but it would probably be pretty funny. We have Rapid Regeneration, that restores armor 300% faster, but reduces the duration of the flag to 10 seconds. Or Focus Strength, which knocks enemies back and makes them lose control for a longer period of time. Out of these 3, I'm going to say go with Rapid Regen, just because it increases the armor regen per second, which inadvertently also then increases your effective health and your ability to tank things. So for this next column, realistically, yeah, these other 2 talent points exist. As long as this one exists, you're never going to take the others. Even with the nerf to make it recharge 100% slower, or take twice as long for those of you who are bad at math, regenning all squad members' maximum contested health is gargantuan. This will save runs. Yes, the doubling of the cooldown hurts. Make friends with a Vanguard. If the Vanguard you're already friends with doesn't run inner fire, fire them, make friends with a new one. For this next one, I am always going to be a fan of Rejuvenating Effect, just because being able to do a drive-by revive on somebody who's gone down, that matters. Other options here would be Merciless Resolve, which increases your melee damage by 15% after a shield bash, and you don't lose control, blah blah blah. This kind of doubles up on Armored Advance a little bit, but this would also be active while you're running without armor. So if you really wanted to lean into Shield Bash, what you could do is go all of the Shield Bash improving perks, run the 2 shock builds, pick out forward momentum, and then you run a block weapon. And then you would do a silly amount of damage. So you could do that if you didn't want the wider utility and ability to actually have a tank. For the signature perks here, Emergency Countermeasure is still 2 minutes, which just drops a free shock grenade at your feet when your armor pops. Again, that's cool, but it's outshined by other options. Defensive Mastery instantly incapacitates a Majoris or Extremis once every 2 minutes. Think of it kind of like a worse version of the Tacticals headshot on a thing that's been auspexed. But realistically, I still feel like Armored Advance is the play here, which says if you have armor remaining, you do not lose control on taking heavy hits, and you cannot be knocked back. So, in the rare instances, well, not so rare, at least speaking for myself, where you do miss a parry, you're not going to be staggered and unable to respond to follow-up attacks by all of the other things trying to eat your face. This does come with a risk. Since you're not going to be staggered and enjoying the benefit of a small amount of iframes in that stagger, there is the possibility of enemies all spacing their attacks out such that you just get deleted. So, know that this isn't a freebie, and it demands that you pay some attention. All right, we're coming into the home stretch here with the Sniper. Sniper and Heavy both got pretty significant buffs all around with this patch. So, I would say the Sniper has 3 viable builds now, with 3.5 depending upon how good you are at quickscoping. For the sake of simplicity, we're going to focus on the Stalker and the Bolt Carbine. Yes, the Las Fusil is good. You know that, I know that. It's the most meta weapon that the Sniper has. Just do your thing, and you'll be fine. We'll talk about perk change on the character itself as we get to it. For the Stalker, which also saw a significant buff to its damage, because it totally needed that and wasn't already kind of good. Again, I like the one that comes with the extra ammo. This is going to look very similar to the read-through I did on the tactical. Exact same tree, exact same reloaded restoration perk that really makes the ammo economy work. You'll feel the ammo regen a bit more on the tactical versus on the sniper, but in exchange, you get sneaky cloak. For the bolt pistol, again, that looks exactly like it does on the tactical, except you're going to be using it a bit more. So same perk tree, top all the way over to this last headhunter perk, down for extra mag size to get to 10% more damage. For the combat knife, depending upon your personal preference and comfort, I would say go with either of the balance or the fencing knife. If you want to really try hard, go with the balanced or the block. If you want the extra quality of life and just being able to be like, no, go away, be stunned, go with fencing. Perks are the same. So for the combat knife on the sniper, I actually run a completely different build than I do on the Vanguard. On the sniper, we're taking this top tree, making a brief detour to pick up the extra 10% against Tyranid, so you're just doing 10% more to everything. And then picking up this last point for 15% damage on Extremis with the mastery point. The main difference here is that we'd be picking up Shadow Stab. The only build that I run this on is like the weird, like carbine, melee, assassin-y, stabby, shooty thing that people were talking about forever ago. A good chunk of the buffs to the sniper have actually made that pretty viable now, and it's weirdly fun to play. If you're going to run that, use this. If you're not going to run that, go along the bottom line, just like on the Vanguard. Talking about the bolt carbine real quick. Again, I'm always going to go with the one that has the most ammo. And since you're going to be barrel stuffing enemies anyway, accuracy doesn't really matter. Out of all the options we have for perks, I feel like this would probably be the best for how I prefer to play it. You're coming along the top line to pick up spread reduction, some sacrificial points to get further along. This restored health perk works sometimes. It's been consistently bugged for a while now. But realistically, you're coming here for 10% more headshot damage, 20% more headshot damage, extra mag size, more damage, more headshot damage when you're hurt. Don't care about this one. And we're picking up an equipped secondary weapon instantly reloads after a gun strike. I'm not sold on this one, but realistically, your other options are kind of mid, in that you can reduce your recoil by 25%. You can reduce your spread while you're firing but not aiming, which, no, don't do that. Or this one over here that reduces your maximum spread by 10%. I'm thinking I'm probably going to swap over to this one, but I don't know. At this point, I feel like your options are pretty limited. It's a matter of picking the one that you prefer. All right, so for sniper perks itself here. On this first column, you have block break. Shots will penetrate enemy block stances, dealing 25% of the usual damage, which sounds nifty. And then you realize that, like, overall, that math just really doesn't work in terms of your ammo economy, especially on absolute. So your other options here become melee mastery for a flat 20% extra damage against Majoris and higher, or Medicae Adept, which lets you revive squatties 30% faster. So for this one, yes, there's a decent amount of utility to being able to res your teammates faster. If they're going down that often, well, that's a problem. So this is one of those times where I am actually going to lean towards being selfish with a build and go with melee mastery, because a flat 20% damage buff, especially if you're using the balanced combat knife, like, it does work when things get up in your face. For the second column here, we have high capacity, which gives you an extra 10% ammo, vantage point, which gives you 20% extra damage if you stay still for 2 seconds, which is not the most viable thing on higher difficulties, or adaptability, which lets you get an increase to melee damage anytime you reload while having low ammo or manually activating camo cloak. So here is where we start to see some variation in the builds. We're going to run through the basic one first, and then we'll talk about the carbine build and the las fusel build. So for this third column, we're going to go with Iron Grip. Weapon spread and recoil are reduced by 20%, and range damage against Terminus is increased by 15% for both the Bolt Sniper and Stalker Bolt. The Stalker does quite a bit of work now. I mean, it did before, it is just incrementally better. When I was testing this, you could do the cloak to stalker shot and put a Tyranid warrior into execute on 3 headshots on absolute. That's nice. If you're going to run the carbine, you're going to go with dexterous hands instead, because again, it reloads faster and the weapon spread and recoil are reduced by 15%. For both of these, we're less concerned about the recoil reduction because, well, you can just pull your mouse down or pull down on the right stick. But the weapon spread change is significant, so make the use of it. If you are going to run the las, obviously you're going to go with lethal efficiency. Killing more than 1 enemy with 1 shot restores its charge by 1. It doesn't really have a great ammo pool, so anything you can do to offset that is good. So this late into the video, I'm really starting to notice a trend with the team and signature perks, and that they're really trying to make the other 2 options more appealing and still kind of failing at it. So in this one, we have marksmanship, which increases headshot damage by 10% for all of your squad. Cool. Precision targeting, which reduces your spread further by 25%. And range damage against extremis is increased by 10% for all squad members. This one would be better if it was extremis and higher. But in terms of the overall value this delivers, I would say both of these still lose out to squad renewal, which says every headshot kill, even if it's a Minoris, restores your ability charge by 10%. That's across everybody. Now, if you want to get real silly, run Vanguard Sniper and have that third person be a Bulwark, you have friendship flag for days. What nerf? For the gear column, we actually do have some meaningful options now, which is nifty. The changes to purification are pretty significant. If you find yourself wanting more tank, this is quite nice. This gives you an extra, oh shit button in case you eat a huge hit, your entire health bar suddenly turned white and you're like, oh god, what's going on? You just mash cloak, grats, you're good. Efficient readiness sounds nifty, but in terms of overall utility, the 10% extra movement speed on camo cloak, I mean, if you're going to be using camo cloak correctly, you're only in it very briefly before you fire. So cool in theory, less effective in actual play. Renewal, headshot kill restores camo cloak's charge by 5%. I would say on this column here, your options are either purification, if you want the extra tank and the oh shit button, or going with renewal and having 5% of your camo cloak charge come back every time you hit something in the dome. I'm sticking with this one. Up next, we have Guardian Protocol, which, again, cloaks the person you're rezzing as well as yourself for 5 seconds. Cool. Again, if people on your team are dying often enough that this becomes a problem, maybe level up your own skill and their own skill. Targeted shot. First ranged attack that breaks camo cloak deals 75% more damage. Yes, this does stack with the ability perk from camo cloak as a class, which gives you an additional 25% more damage. This is far more feasible, even with the stalker. Obviously, it works with the las, it works with the bolt sniper. It's really good because if you take this paired with lingering concealment, which lets you stay in camo cloak for 2 seconds after you've fired, you find the thing you want to perforate, you aim at it, you hit cloak, you fire as quickly as possible. That first shot that used barely any of your cloak charge does a stupid amount of extra damage, and then you're still in cloak for 2 seconds while it goes and fights something else. It's nice. Your other option here would be tactical ambush, which does basically the same thing, but for melee damage instead. So here's where you would use that instead of targeted shot if you were going to use the bolt carbine. Because if you can do this and then stack that with shadow stab, which, if you charge it longer, the more damage it does, you can take full health Majoris to executable in 1 hit, which is nifty. It's just a very different playstyle. All right, for the last column on gear, persistence, no, just no. You take 20% less health damage, you don't lose control on heavy hits, you can't get knocked back when camo cloak deactivates. I mean, that sounds cool, especially if we're going to be dipping in and out of camo cloak as often as we are, but you don't really have any sustain anyway, so you want to really avoid getting hit at all. I already talked about why I like lingering concealment. Your other option would be ambush. Camo cloak deactivates, it startles nearby enemies. They will temporarily lose control or get knocked back. Cooldown is 25 seconds. Again, this sounds cool. From what I was testing, it seems as though The charge on Shadow Stab would actually cause you to come out of cloak. So you kind of need lingering concealment to make the Shadow Stab still have that really significant damage boost. And for the signature perks, like I talked about in the patch response video, I still really like Evasion, because 5 seconds of free cloak that completely resets your aggro once every 15 seconds if you get a perfect dodge. The potential uptime and value for that perk is gargantuan. Other options here would be the cheat death. So when you receive lethal damage, Camo Cloak activates, you become invulnerable for 5 seconds, 3-minute cooldown. I mean, sure, that's fine. The game has changed significantly, and our understanding of the game has changed enough that I'm not as much of a fan of cheat deaths as a mechanic as they exist in the game. Maybe that will change with later perk reworks, but for now, it's not great. Your other option would be the recently buffed Pattern of Excellence, which now lets you restore your equipment charge once every 3 minutes for 3 consecutive headshots. So if you were consistently finding crack grenades or melt-a-bombs, well, you can consistently get more of them every 3 minutes. I would say either this or Evasion are both fine. If you prefer more defensive play, go with Evasion. If you're able to use melt-a-bombs without blowing yourself up, go with Pattern of Excellence. All right, and finally rounding things out here with the Heavy. Again, both the Heavy and the Sniper got some pretty significant buffs all around, which is really cool. My build from before still works with very few modifications. And you still enjoy the fact that the Heavy Bolter, the Heavy Plasma Incinerator, and the Multi-Melta, yes, it's still purple. I refuse to use the Multi-Melta. You know it's good. I know it's good. Pick whatever perks you want on it. You'll be fine. Anyway, let's start with the Heavy Bolter. For the Mordaka machine, I prefer the version that comes with the extra accuracy, because it doesn't matter how many rounds you have if you can't hit the thing you're aiming at downrange. And remember, as I said before, your job as the Heavy is to take it personally that things existed downrange. For perks, it looks exactly the same as my previous build, except you're now going to be picking up fast venting with the extra mastery point from maxing out Relic. That gives you an extra 15% cooling, which works really well on the Heavy Bolter, especially when you manage to feather it at just the right amount of overheat. You don't really need to take Heavy Immunity, since we're covering that with a choice of perk on the character itself. And taking a look at the Heavy Plasma Incinerator, again, I prefer the version that has the faster venting speed, just because of the shenanigans you can get up to with breakpoints, and then if you do manage to overheat, well, you're going to be cooling a little bit faster. If you prefer the one that has the faster rate of fire, cool, you do you. Realistically, I don't run into as much ammo problems with this one, so the one that comes with extra mag capacity is comparatively less useful. Looking at perks, it's the same wiggly thing we did before. Common shots generate 10% less heat. I mean, that's cool if you're gonna plunk those out. This gives you rapid cooling, so after you kill 10 things in rapid succession, your weapons don't generate any heat for 5 seconds, which is nice. While in heavy stance, your charged shots charge 10% faster. Extra energy, less energy used on charged shots. Adamant Restoration, which is going to really make your life significantly easier when it comes to the ammo economy. Extra fire rate while charging in heavy stance. Extra damage on your charged shot. More extra damage on your charged shot. This one, cool. After a perfectly timed dodge, you deal 25% more damage. Sure, great. But this extra mastery point lets you now get charged shots generate 10% less heat, which is always nice. Moving on to the plasma pistol. This looks exactly the same as it does on the Bulwark. Extra ammo. Go with this wiggly thing so that it charges as quickly as possible and does the most damage. So, again, this is an interruption machine. Now, looking at the actual talent perks for the heavy, on this first column, so for restoration, you kill 10 enemies in rapid succession, restores 1 armor segment, cooldown is 15 seconds. I'm a fan of this one, unless I'm using the Multi-Melta, just because you're going to be mowing things down pretty consistently anyway, so extra armor means extra tank. If you are using the Multi-Melta, obviously you're going to take multi-kill, just so that if you manage to delete 5 things at once, you get that ammo back. This last one, auxiliary ammunition, when your primary is out of ammo, killing 10 things in rapid succession restores ammo reserve by 20% once every 30 seconds. Yes, you could make use of this with that plasma pistol that we have equipped. If you're already hurting that much for ammo, you're probably having a bad time. So personally, I would rather stick with the thing that helps me stay alive longer. For the next column, you have thermal boost, which gives you an extra 15% damage when you're 50% overheated. You could use this on the plasma or the heavy bolter. However, I feel like other options are better, especially with the changes to like economy and just how much things hurt. You could take a flat 20% increase to your health. It sounds good on paper. Or you could take strategic stand. So while in heavy stance, dealing any damage restores 15% more contested health. You don't lose control on taking heavy hits, and you cannot be knocked back, but you cannot move. So if you stack this with the correct team comp, you can literally stand there and tank multiple Majoris so long as you're holding yourself in heavy stance, and you'll just regen the contested health as quickly as they can do it to you. It's silly. For the third column, we have the new enhanced force that just gives you a flat 30% buff to melee damage. Sounds nice. However, we're still using my weird hopping in and out of Iron Halo build. That still works quite well. So we're going to go with overwhelming power. So all squad members within 10 meters deal 10% more range damage while Iron Halo is active, which is cool. That includes you. If you didn't want to go with this build, sure, you could go with versatility instead and, hot swap between and actually get significantly more damage buffs out of your plasma pistol. But again, I feel like this has better overall synergy. For the team perks, you have Encompassing Aegis. So all of your squad takes 25% less damage from ranged attacks, which is significant, honestly. This is quite strong. Also have additional supplies, just a flat 25% increase of ammo capacity for all of your squad, or Bonds of Brotherhood. So reviving a squaddie restores them to full health. We kind of already talked about this in the sniper. Choosing your team perk based on misplay, maybe not the greatest thing. Realistically, depending on who you're playing with, I can see either Encompassing Aegis or additional supplies being equally valuable. For me, and the people I normally play with, I'm going to go with additional supplies because more ammo means more DACA, which means more dead things. For the gear perks, I'm sticking with Adamant Will, which lets us take 20% less health damage for 10 seconds after Iron Halo deactivates. Other options here would be the recently buffed Consecutive Execution. If you're a Melt-A-Bomb stan, you could go with this too if you wanted. I don't. Emperor's Protection is interesting. When Iron Halo expends all of its energy, one armor segment is restored for all squad members. So this sets up the precedent of if you're not going to manually turn on and off Iron Halo, just having this automatically go off when you've spent all of your energy on Iron Halo could also be viable. There's a couple other talent choices that would support this. However, I feel like the uptime of consistently having the buffs from Overwhelming Power, Adamant Will, Field Adjustment, and Brute Force, because it doesn't matter, realistically, whether you have your Iron Halo on or not, you are always giving a buff either to yourself or your entire team. So leading into that, on this column, your options are Obliterate Bastion, which increases Iron Halo's durability by 20%, not bad. Field Adjustment, it recharges 20% faster, but its durability is reduced by 25%, or Power Regulator. Iron Halo loses energy 20% more slowly. So in terms of pure math, there might be a couple percentage differences between these two. Like if it loses energy 20% more slowly, that's effectively 20% more recharge-ish, but tinker with either of these to see which you like better. For the last column in gear, we have Saving Grace, which fully restores Iron Halo's charge and armor segments. Cool. This could be a run saver, especially if you're having a bad enough time that you're reviving people frequently. We have Brute Force. When Iron Halo is on cooldown, range damage increases by 15%. This one only applies to you, but again, since you're popping Iron Halo and then turning it off, you're pretty much almost always going to have this going, or you're going to get the 10% more range damage while it's active. So between these two, you're getting 10 or 15% damage buff just all the time. Enjoy that. Your other option would be Wrath of the Imperium. When Iron Halo expends all of its energy, enemies within a 10-meter radius take significant damage. In light of the other options, I'm just going to say no. And for the signature perks of the very last class of the video, we have Offensive Capability. While active, Iron Halo deals damage over time to all enemies within 5 meters. You have a Heavy Bolter for that. Just no. Coolant Reserve. If both of your squaddies are incapacitated, defeated, or grabbed, your primary weapon will not overheat and you deal 15% more damage. I mean, yeah, there are opportunities for playmaking if you take this as well as Saving Grace, but I would rather have it so I'm not banking on things going terribly. So I'm still sticking with Conversion Field. Now, in the patch notes, they specifically said that it was a typo in the talent. Now, we can choose to believe that or not, to your preference of how many layers of tinfoil you want to put on your head. If we were using it before and seeing the benefit before, nothing has changed, regardless of whether or not it was a typo or if it was actually going to 100 meters. So, when Iron Halo is active, all squad members within 10 meters regenerate ability charge 50% faster. So again, this leans into the idea of it doesn't matter whether your Iron Halo is on or not, you are consistently buffing yourself and your team. Enjoy. Send some lead downrange. So there we have it. We have updated builds for all of the classes for 6.0. As I said in the outset, less change than even I was anticipating, really. Yes, there are some pretty meaningful nerfs across the board, and I think you can still work around that, especially now that I've put all of these builds back together and tested everything over the course of the last, 30 hours. It really seems as though they're leaning into the idea that no one person should be able to carry an entire team. So perhaps be a bit more purposeful with your team construction. There are options so that you don't have to pug. There's plenty of people in our Discord. You can also check out the Astartes Overhaul modding Discord. The Space Marine 2 community on Reddit also has its own. Don't leave yourself to the mercy of matchmaking. Anyhow, I have no idea how long this video has been, but it feels like a really long time. I've been Bald Squid. I'll catch y'all next time.